the Latina Leadership Podcast, the podcast made for Latinas by Latinas, with Anjelica Cázares, Carolina Arenas, Diana Ruby, Jacqueline Villagomez, and Sonia Ramirez. Get comfortable, amiga, and enjoy the conversations.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of Latina Leadership Series. I am your host, Anjelica Cázares. And on today's episode, well, hold on. First, let me start off with the fact that I am quite nervous. I am quite nervous for my next guest. I have been anticipating something like this for this show for quite some time. I have the amazing Dr. Ellen Ochoa, the first Latina into space, the first Hispanic to be director of the NASA space of the Johnson Space Center there in Houston, Texas. But Ellen, I I think everybody knows you. I think I did like a small little write up um, in your career has affected a lot of us, right? And so I remember doing a report and it was on you back in high school. So I don't think I have to introduce you very much, but I would love if you could just introduce yourself and tell us who you are.
Of course. Well, I spent 30 years at NASA, started there as an engineer, research engineer, and then I was selected as an astronaut. And I was the first Latina in space. I flew on the space shuttle 4 times. And then I spent the last half of my career in a variety of management and leadership positions, culminating in being the director of Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas.
As I said, the reason that I'm nervous is because I remember I think years ago, we were doing some like work a little bit with like influencers, and we happened to take them to the space center there in Houston, and you were like showing around when you were the director at that time, and I was like, I know that's Ellen Ochoa, and I was like, I ran up to you and I was like, Ellen, hi, and I think I went on about this story of the report that I did when I was in high school, and I remember uh, telling people when I was doing this podcast, I was like, eventually I want to have, I mean, I have amazing Latina leaders who come on here all the time, but I was like, there is something about having, I don't know, the first Latinx, like Hispanic woman, but like in space, like there's something about that. But before we dive into like all the grandiose things that you've done in your career, I want to take it back a little bit to like get to know you a little bit on the more personal side.
Okay.
So in reading, many articles that are written up about you, but in reading in some of your past, you were born in California and raised in La Mesa. Can you tell us a little bit about your childhood?
Sure. La Mesa is a suburb of San Diego. So, kind of grew up in the suburban life. My first interest was music. I think that was my older sister's influence, but all my brothers and sisters and I ended up playing instruments. So, I was in the high school marching band and concert band and the California All-State Honor Band, and thought about pursuing that in college. Ended up just doing it as a hobby. But it really wasn't until I was partway through college before I got interested in science or engineering. So It wasn't something I was really focused on when I was little.
On the engineering. So did this, it's not really something, especially when I wasn't growing up, it wasn't something that we did. There wasn't much space for us to be like either in math or the science or any of those fields. What was it about? Was there somebody that like helped you, or did you take an interest in regards to like going into that field?
I guess what I would say is I was 11 when the Apollo 11 astronauts landed on the moon. And so, of course, everybody was talking about that, not only around the country, but actually around the world. But at that time, there weren't any women astronauts. And even though there were a few women at NASA, my impression was there really weren't any. I mean, I certainly never saw them or heard about them. And I didn't know any scientists or engineers, but I liked math. I always did well in math. In high school, I took all the math that I could. And so it was really after I was in college and I was finishing up the calculus series that I just thought, well, I should explore some subjects that actually use the math that I've been learning. And so I went to talk to a couple professors. This was at San Diego State University. And the first one, an engineering professor, was clearly not at all interested in having me in his department. He went, well, we did have a woman come through here once, but it's a really difficult course of study, and I don't know that you'd be interested in what we do. Which was kind of ironic because the whole reason I went to talk to him was to learn more about it. But fortunately, I got a much different reception when I went to talk to a physics professor, and he was glad to hear I was interested in exploring physics. He talked about careers that you could have if you majored in physics. And that was actually really important because I didn't have a good idea about what that was. And it's hard to think about majoring in something when you can't really picture where it's headed. And then when he found out I was finishing up the calculus series, he said, well, that's great. You've already learned the language of physics. If you started into our classes next semester, you could concentrate on the concepts. And most students will be trying to learn those two things simultaneously. So I think you do really well. It just kind of goes to show you that what people say to you really make a difference. Because, after those two conversations, I thought I'd give physics a try. And that's how I ended up majoring in physics. And then I minored in math.
That's a long way from taking an interest in becoming an astronaut. And I read on an article that it wasn't until you seen an actual a female astronaut that you thought, okay, this is probably a projection that I can take. Did it happen like that?
Well, more or less. I mean, when I was still an undergraduate majoring in physics is when NASA selected the first group of astronauts that were going to train for a new vehicle they were in the middle of developing, the space shuttle. And this class was the first one that included women, had 6 women, and the first one that included astronauts of color too. So it looked very different than previous astronaut classes. And I definitely took note of that, but I had really only just switched my major to physics. So, I still at that time wasn't thinking about the astronaut program. But a few years later, so I graduated in physics. I had gotten interested in research through a couple of summer research jobs. And so I went off to graduate school, which you really need a graduate degree if you're going to pursue research. And near the end of my first year, this was at Stanford University. And by this time, I actually was in the engineering department. The space shuttle flew for the first time. And it was a very different kind of spacecraft and was capable of doing a lot of different things. But certainly one of the things that they were going to use it for quite a bit was to do research. Research you couldn't do in any lab on Earth because you were taking advantage of the space environment, whether it was the microgravity or being above the Earth's atmosphere, something like that. And then a couple years later, when I was in the middle of getting my PhD, is when Sally Ride flew. And of course, that was a huge deal, the first American woman in space. And she had gone to Stanford and she had been a physics major. So I could see these various things that I had in common with her. And that's really when I started to think about it seriously.
Me and my husband used to have this discussion back in the day where I would tell him, the idea that representation matters. I remember having those classes, and of course, it was instructors and teachers who were of male, and of course, they weren't exactly like they couldn't. I don't think there was any relevance that they could actually there was nothing that I took interest in it because I couldn't see myself there
Exactly.
because there wasn't exactly any representation. And now that I'm reading some of your items, that's sort of the conversation that you're taking on now. That's a topic that you're kind of, I guess, leaving part of your legacy is to have those conversations to get women and especially young women interested, people of BIPOC interested in STEM, physics, mathematics.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit about that? Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's not just getting young women interested in it. It's getting the teachers and professors and counselors to encourage them, to welcome them, to have the kind of environment where they're going to feel like, well, I belong here. Because for so long, the environment in many ways has been, well, you're nothing like, the other engineers or scientists. So yeah, I think it really is important. We need all the brightest minds out there. And of course, the talent exists everywhere. Unfortunately, the opportunity has not existed everywhere. And there are a lot of groups that are underrepresented in these STEM fields, just women in general, and certainly people of color in general as well. Low socioeconomic background certainly also affects that, because that affects the ability to think about higher education. So those are all things that I've had the opportunity to get involved with somehow, either at NASA or on the National Science Board, or, just going around speaking.
So I have a theory that women kind of bring a different perspective to different fields. Would you say, in the world of aeroeconomics, in the world of STEM, in the world of all of this, would you say it kind of is the same, that women bring a different perspective or aspect to the field?
Well, I certainly think you're missing out on a lot when you have a fairly narrow group, right?
Yes, yes.
And so the more kinds and types of people with different backgrounds and different experiences, and just, kind of different ways that the brain works, I think that all is going to be important. When you think about science, it's about new discovery. But what are the questions people are asking in terms of doing research? And, I think you get a much wider variety of questions being asked, when you include women or when you include other groups that haven't been. And when you think about engineering, it's really about solving challenges. And again, different people are going to have different ways of looking at a problem. And it may be because they're a different gender, and it may be because they have different experiences. They've had different experiences in their lives, in their families, in their communities. And so they're going to approach these challenges differently. And we need that.
Yeah. So in the approach of doing getting different aspects, I want to touch a little bit about you as a director there for the NASA Space Center. The Johnson Space Center, we call it NASA there in Houston. And I'm like, I'm so used to that. So the Johnson Space Center, you as the director, what direction did you take that organization, or what was it that you did differently?
Well, I think, everybody who comes in as the head of an organization is trying to understand how do I ensure that this organization thrives?
Mm-hmm.
And, so overall, my goal is thinking 10 or 20 years down the line. I want to help make sure that Johnson Space Center, or I'll call it JSC because that's what we call it, is still leading human spaceflight exploration for our country. And so the context in which I became director, which was right at the end of 2012 or the beginning of 2013, was a couple of things. First of all, there was a trend of new organizations getting involved in human spaceflight, or in supporting human spaceflight, even if it was with cargo missions. So companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin and a variety of others. And so, it was a different, we weren't sort of the only game in town like we used to.
Yeah.
And the other main trend then in that particular year, the budget for NASA overall, the entire budget, was less in terms of buying power than it had been in 50 years. And so you had to think about, well, we still are responsible for carrying out all these human spaceflight missions, operational missions and development missions. And we can't keep doing it the same way for both of those reasons. We don't have the budget, and there's other players out there, and we have to understand how we need to evolve. So that was a big portion of really what I focused on. I started up a change initiative called JSC 2.0. And it was really about how do we advance human spaceflight by being more lean, agile, and adaptive to change. We tried to look at, our procedures and how they should change, our partners, who we should be partnering with, new technology, just really tried to rethink how we were doing things and who we were working with in order to move forward. And as you do that, you realize, okay, one of the things that we can do is make the most out of every single person that we have at our center. And so that really gets into the whole idea of having an inclusive environment, because we need everybody coming into work, bringing their ideas, bringing their problem solving, thinking about new ways of doing things, and speaking up when they see something that is unsafe, which is incredibly important in our industry. Well, the only way people are going to do that is if they feel valued and they feel respected. And that only happens if you have an inclusive environment. So for many reasons, but certainly for the future of JSE, it was really important to focus on that as well.
That sounds like an amazing program. Is it something that was after you left? Is it still part of things that are implemented still to this day?
Oh yes, it took a variety of different forms, and actually, when I was deputy center director, the current director then started up a number of things which we continued and then we added to. So we started up employee resource groups, which were really focused on first of all, giving a voice to people that maybe didn't have it, giving them leadership opportunities, but overall making JSC stronger. We formed what we called the Innovation and Inclusion Council, which was made up of some of our senior leaders, to look at new initiatives every year or two, which would really focus on inclusion and help hopefully spark innovation as well, because they are related. We started a program called, what did we call it? TOP, Transparent Opportunities Program. And so this was going beyond sort of formal procedures like how you do promotions, to look at sort of informal opportunities that people have, and trying to make sure that we provided those informal opportunities to a much wider group of employees, and really concentrating on the training development of our employees, and maybe in particular employees that have traditionally maybe not gotten those opportunities or been left behind a little bit. And again, it was about making the most of every person at our center. So we had these various different sort of programs or initiatives, and they're still doing that today.
When you speak and you're among the general public, you're very much listened to when you speak. But I know and I understand that sometimes when you go into smaller spaces where you are like, I guess, equal or the same to your peers in that space, sometimes speaking up is difficult for women, and especially women of color. Did you find yourself in those positions? How did you speak up and speak out? Because as a trailblazer yourself, how do you know what you're doing, and when is it for you? When is it time for you to speak up? Or did you just, like, I don't know, is it a gene of yours, or how do you know? Or what advice would you give?
Well, I would say certainly early in my career, it was very difficult for me to speak up. I was certainly, I think about some of my earlier research engineering positions before I got to NASA. I was at a lab, and in the particular group I was in, there was about 60 PhD researchers. I was the only woman, and very little diversity in any other way as well. And I'm just naturally an introvert. That's just my character. And so you put that all together, and yes, I was not inclined to speak up, hesitant to speak up, felt like everybody would remember every single word I said. And so I had this feeling like, well, I'm going to have to think of something brilliant to say before I actually, speak up, which is just way too high a bar, right? And in fact, some of my early supervisors, that was some of the feedback they gave me. Hey, you need to speak up more in meetings. Nobody knows you're there. And we're not getting the benefit of your contribution. So I had to concentrate on that. I had to actually work at it. I tried to pay a lot of attention to what other people said when they spoke up. And part of it is I had to convince myself that, not everything everybody else was saying was brilliant either. It was just, kind of run of the mill comments. And I needed to, when I had one of those, speak up. And then as I learned more, I would be able to contribute more, and my comments would, make a difference. I would say, after I got to NASA, and particularly in the astronaut office, um, particularly when I got assigned to my first crew, it was 5 people. 3 of them had flown in space before, and then 2 of us were rookies. But with only 5 people, you are responsible for a lot on that mission. So I was responsible for the science experiments during my shift. We were operating 24 hours a day, so we had a couple different shifts. We were studying the Earth's atmosphere, particularly the problem of ozone hole and ozone depletion. So there were a lot of scientists on the ground, that were depending on the instruments working. I was also the prime robotic arm operator and was using it to pick up a science satellite out of the shuttle payload bay and deploy it into orbit. And then 2 days later, we came back and rendezvoused with it. And I needed to use the arm to grab it and put it back in the payload bay. And so I knew there were going to be a lot of eyes on that. So as I went through training, I knew it was really important to learn what I needed to learn, to ask questions when I had any kind of questions at all, to even ask what kind of questions should I be asking. I think it was that experience that as I went through the rest of my NASA career, I just sort of grew on that, realizing that, I needed to do the best job I could. So I needed to ask questions. And then when I had things to contribute to make those comments as well.
That's definitely a question I did want to ask you, because as somebody who has such authority, I understand and know that when they speak among their peers, it's a whole different ballgame. It's a whole different kind of thing. And learning how to speak up in those spaces becomes sort of like a chore. Like, how do I know what I'm saying it is? And you find yourself thinking to yourself, leaving spaces and thinking, oh my God, what a dummy. What did I say? I don't even know if I was heard or if they know what I was saying. And, but thank you for that. I definitely want our listeners to know that that kind of that issue lies among all of us. Being able to assert yourself in situations where you know what you're saying is correct, and being able to ask questions and get insights and make sure you're getting the most of your time in the spaces that you are. But before I let you go, as I said, I definitely am very aware of your time. I want to talk a little bit about the books that you've been writing, because you're an author now. And a lot of them are children's books, I see. Can you tell us why why the books more so are for children as opposed to young adults or adults themselves, or your biography and things like that?
Well, I was actually approached by
Okay.
a small publishing company that focuses solely on bilingual children's books. And they had published a number of books, but really didn't have hardly anything in the STEM fields.
Mm-hmm.
And so they wanted to build up what they had there. So they came to me with an idea of writing 5 books, one for each of the letters of STEAM: science, technology, engineering, arts, and math. And of course, have at least something about space in each one of them, but really introducing kids to those subjects. And at the same time, starting that conversation between the kids and whoever reads these books to them. It could be older siblings, parents, grandparents, teachers, librarians, and building up that vocabulary in 2 languages. I'm sure you know many families where maybe the grandparents only speak Spanish.
Mm-hmm.
The grandkids are mainly growing up speaking English, but then having this book where the words are in both languages is something that can bring them together. And I've actually gotten some good feedback. The first one on science has been published.
Mm-hmm.
A couple more will come out this year, and then probably the 4th and 5th ones next year. But what has really been great for me is to hear from families where that's exactly what happened. In fact, sometimes it's the child who might be 5 or 6 and can already read English, who's reading that to the grandparent, and then the grandparent's reading the Spanish to them. Or sometimes vice versa. It just depends on the family. So this wasn't something I had thought about, earlier until I was approached. And then I realized, well, this is just another way that I can reach out to to young kids, and especially girls or especially Latinx kids, and get them thinking about STEM, and hopefully get the whole family thinking about STEM.
Get them excited about it. Were you raised in a household where you spoke both languages?
I wish I was,
Okay.
but my dad really did not want to speak Spanish around the house. He only did it a little bit, maybe at mealtime, when you're passing food or something like that. But when he was growing up, his parents were Mexican. They got married and had their first kids in Mexico, and then they emigrated to the U.S. And when he was growing up, he was the youngest of 12, so he was born here. It was not looked on favorably to speak Spanish. And so I think when he had kids, he just thought it's not important. It's important that they speak English. And my mother, who actually isn't Hispanic, but she had learned Spanish when she married my dad, so she could talk to his family, especially his mother. And she wanted us to grow up bilingual, and she would try to speak a little Spanish to us. She took us to a neighbor who was from Spain to give us some Spanish lessons, but really without hearing it day in and day out, we didn't really grow up bilingual. And that's something that I wish we had had that opportunity, my brothers and sisters and me.
Well, the fact that you're contributing back to the language and contributing back to the like making sure that there is a way that young children can communicate with their grandparents. I mean, it's very much admirable. But so what's next for you, Dr. Ellen Ochoa? What's next on your docket that you're doing next outside of books?
Well, I continue to speak in a variety of venues, and of course, there's quite a bit out there on social media. I'm also on several boards, including ones that are associated with some kind of STEM, whether it's science or engineering. And so I get to keep my hand in that. Of course, I follow along closely with what NASA is doing. And when I'm speaking, obviously my audiences also always have really good questions about what's going on with NASA today or space exploration in general. So I get to continue to do that.
Well, that's amazing. As I said earlier, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today. Where can we find you? Where can our listeners and where can our listeners and viewers find you?
Well, I have a website, ellenochoa.com, and that has news about me and photos and some of my upcoming events if they're open to the public, a little bit about my book. And so, yes, you can get information there.
Awesome. Is there something that you would like to add that I didn't ask or that you would like to include?
Oh, I just appreciate you including me on your podcast. And I think it's fantastic that you're doing a series on Latina leadership. And I'm really happy to be part of it.
I am over the moon that you accepted. I am thank you. Thank you for giving that little Anjelica an opportunity to go back and revisit somebody that she admired very much growing up in high school. But Dr. Ellen Ochoa, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
What did you think of the conversation? If you enjoyed what you heard, let us know in the comments. And please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with your friends. Thank you for listening to the Latina Leadership Podcast, and we will see you next time.